In this video, we're going to get started hanging some of the plastic pieces on a frame. By the time we're done, we'll have everything set up for the Z-axis except for the motors. To get started, we're going to need an assembled frame, an assembled bed carriage frame. We're going to need M5 by 10 screws in this case. We're using the longer screws because the plastic pieces they go through are a little bit thicker, and we need the extra length to make sure that they engage in the T-nuts properly. We're going to need 8 LM8UU linear bearings, M3 lock nuts, M3 by 20 screws, and a package of the 2020 hammer nuts. We're also going to need 8 400mm, 8mm linear rods. We're going to need 2 left and 2 right of the Z carriages, 2 left and 2 right of the Z carriage bearing caps, 4 of the lower Z rod holders, 4 of the upper Z rod holders, the Z rod holder setting tool, a clamp, an M3 Allen driver, an M3 ball end driver, a 5.5mm nut driver, a Phillips head screwdriver, and if your screws are not Phillips head, if they're hex head, you're going to need a 2mm screwdriver for the M3 Allen screws. Alright, let's start by assembling the Z carriages. There are left and right Z carriages, and there are left and right bearing caps that go with them. Make sure that you have them matched up. One thing I like to do before I get started is make sure that the M3 screws pass through these openings easily. And in this case, they're a little bit tight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a drill at low speed and just very carefully run through each one of the holes with a 1/8 inch drill bit, and that will make sure that the M3 screw passes nice and easy through each one of them. And I'm going to do that to all of my plastic parts before I get started to make sure that, again, the M3 screws go through and they rotate easily into parts, because we don't want them self-tapping into these particular parts. Now that we have all of the pieces drilled out with the 1/8 inch drill bit, we can go ahead and start assembling. So we're going to get 2 of the LM8UU bearings and drop them right into the carriage. This is the Z carriage. This particular one is for the right side. We're going to locate a matching cap, and the notch in the cap is slightly offset up, and you'll notice that the notch for the screws at the bottom are a little bit offset up, so they're closer to the edge here, and then they're a little bit spaced out here, and that's to kind of centralize right over the center of the bushing or the bearings. We're going to pass some of the M3 by 20 screws right through at all 4 of the holes for the screws. We're going to thread on some of the M3 lock nuts. Just to get the thread started. Okay, once the threads are started, we're going to put our nut driver on one side, and we're going to tighten the screw just until the point where it's contacting the plastic and no tighter. And what you want to end up with is a screw and nut combination that are kind of locked together, but when you turn them with either the nut driver or with the screwdriver, they actually turn freely. So that's a little bit tight when I turn it. There we go. You want this to have the screw engage the lock nut properly so it doesn't come loose, but really not much tighter than that. And once you've achieved that, go ahead and do the same thing on all 3 of the other screws. I've assembled the Z carriages now, and I've checked that all the screws turn freely but are fully engaged in a lock nut on the back, and they have no vertical play. The part is designed to have a little bit more than a 1/2 millimeter gap all the way around the perimeter, so do not try to tighten this down to make the plastic pieces meet. You know you've got it right when you put it on an 8 millimeter rod and it spins freely, and it'll drop under gravity. If it doesn't do that, make sure that your bearings are well oiled. Make sure that there's no pieces of plastic in the bore of the plastic parts where the bearings lay that would cause them to get misaligned. And make sure that you have all of your screws set exactly like I showed you so that they spin freely but have no vertical play. If you're feeling that there's a rumbling or there's not a smooth movement when you slide this up and down the 8 millimeter rod, it could be that these screws are too tight. If they're too tight, it'll cock the bearings and the bearings won't sit properly. The next step in assembly is to mount the Z-carriages to the bed frame. To do that, I've installed M5 by 10 millimeter screws and T-nuts in all of the Z-carriages. What we're going to do next is insert one of the Z-carriages into the channel and stand up the piece so that it'll sit vertically, and make sure that the back edge or the outside edge of the Z-carriage is flush against the build surface. Then tighten the lock nut or tighten the T-nut at both locations. Now this is very important. There is a left and a right to each one of these. So the next one will have to be installed in this orientation so that the bed mounts to the top surface. And we're going to go ahead and do that now and repeat that on the other side. At this point, we have the Z-carriage assembly pretty much complete. They are flush with the edges. The screws are snug down. It's not necessary to tighten these all down to kind of their final torque at this point in time, because we're going to loosen these once we have all the rods installed to kind of let them find their own centers and align themselves. So now we can set this piece apart.